Hello, my name is Kevin Youngblood. I teach Bible here at Harding University, and I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk to you for just a few minutes about the book of Daniel and its impact on the New Testament. In lieu of our usual fall lectureship this year, we're giving you this preview of things to come next year when hopefully we'll be able to reassemble for our normal annual lectureship. And what I've been asked to address in this particular study is the book of Daniel and its relationship to the New Testament. So let me begin just by going over some basics about the book of Daniel with you, some preliminaries. The first thing I want to say about the book of Daniel is that Daniel is important in its own right. It's not just its relationship to the New Testament that makes the book of Daniel significant and interesting and relevant for disciples of Jesus Christ. By itself, the book of Daniel teaches us important spiritual truths, important things about how to live the life of faith in the midst of a culture that doesn't support that life, that is not going to congratulate you or pat you on the back for your decision to be a committed follower of Jesus Christ. So the book of Daniel, even standing on its own, has very important things to teach us as disciples of Jesus Christ. So I don't want anyone to get the impression that the book of Daniel has to be connected to the New Testament in order to have significant spiritual value. It does that on its own. And in tandem with this, it's also important to say that the book of Daniel is sacred scripture on its own, even without any explicit relationship to the New Testament. Just like the Apostle Paul reminds us in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, all Scripture is inspired by God and is profitable for doctrine, for correction, for reproof, and so forth. This is true of the book of Daniel just as much as it is any other part of Scripture. So the book of Daniel is itself Scripture, even without reference to the New Testament. But there are some things about the book of Daniel that make it especially difficult for Christians in particular. I think that there's a sense in which the book of Daniel is largely inaccessible to contemporary Christians for a number of reasons, a number of difficulties. One of these is that this is the only book in the entire Bible that is bilingual. And so that's not something that really affects those of us who are reading the Bible simply in English, but it is something that has always fascinated interpreters of the book and that contributes to its mystique and to its difficulty. When I say that the book of Daniel is a bilingual book, what I'm referring to is the fact that the book of Daniel starts out addressing us in Hebrew in chapter 1, all the way to chapter 2, verse 4, or verse 3. And then right in the middle there, it suddenly switches into Aramaic. And it continues in Aramaic all the way until the end of Daniel chapter 7. And then at Daniel chapter 8, verse 1, it switches back to Hebrew. And then continues in Hebrew through the end of chapter 12. So that's very unusual for a biblical book to consist of such large parts in different languages. And this has made the book of Daniel fascinating. I will only make one more comment about the bilingual nature of the book and then move on to some of the other difficulties that make Daniel difficult, I think, for Christians. This change of language from Hebrew to Aramaic probably has to do with a couple of different things. It's probably, first of all, an indication of the composition of the book, that there was an Aramaic section that circulated by itself and then was later added to the Hebrew visions in chapters 8 through 12, and then was given a Hebrew introduction in chapter 1. But as we have it, as a finished product, it does a remarkable thing literarily to experience this shift of language from Hebrew to Aramaic all of a sudden and without warning at the beginning of chapter 2. Chapters 2 through 7 of the book of Daniel all occur with Daniel and his fellow exiles in a foreign land. It emphasizes their captivity, and it's interesting that those chapters that emphasize their captivity are written in the language of their captors. It seems to speak to their experience. It seems to give the reader a sense of this experience. At least a reader who's able to read the book in its original gets this remarkable shock to suddenly be in a different language in chapter 2, just like the exiles experienced the shock of having to hear a foreign language and having to learn that language and be able to converse in it during their exile. So that is perhaps one of the reasons for that, is that it gives us a way of empathizing with what the exiles experienced, with the foreignness of their captivity and all the challenges that it presented to them. But a second thing about the book of Daniel that makes it somewhat inaccessible to contemporary Christians is that it is a strange mix of genre. It's a strange mix of genre. So for the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel, we basically are reading a series of court tales, what we refer to as court tales, stories about what it is like to be a vizier in a royal court, an advisor in an imperial court. So in these kinds of stories talk about the kind of political intrigue and political tensions that Daniel experienced with many of his colleagues as he served first in the Babylonian court and then subsequently in the Persian court. And so it contains all the features you might expect of such a story. Rivalry, a lot of intrigue behind the scenes, political conspiracies going on, and all those kinds of things. So that's the first 6 chapters, and those are the chapters that we're probably most familiar with because it's good fodder for Sunday school, right? So most of us grew up learning the stories about Daniel in the lion's den. Or we learned the stories about the handwriting on the wall of Daniel chapter 5. Or perhaps we remember the stories that we learned about Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the image that consisted of the 4 different kinds of metals and the stone cut out without hands that struck it on its feet and brought it all tumbling down. And then that stone became a great mountain that filled the earth. But then there's this second half of the book of Daniel that consists of a very different genre with which we are much less familiar and that strikes us as very odd. Beginning with Daniel chapter 7 and going all the through to the end of the book in chapter 12, we have a series of bizarre visions. These are dreams that Daniel himself had, and they frightened even Daniel. Daniel himself could not make sense of them without some help, some angelic interpretation. So God sends angels to help Daniel understand the bizarre visions and the strange scenes that just accosted him in the night. So this last half of the book of Daniel is seldom talked about in our churches. We seldom really study this section of Daniel because it's so strange and so bizarre, and the imagery is so foreign to us that we don't really quite know what to do with it, what to make of it, or what it's even referring to. So this mix of genre has made the book very mysterious to us, a difficult book for us to get a handle on. Then another reason why I think that this book is largely inaccessible to contemporary Christians is because it's kind of hard to know where it fits in the larger Christian Bible. It's kind of hard to know where it belongs in the canon because there's been some historical disagreement over this. And the Greek version of the Old Testament, sometimes referred to as the Septuagint, the book of Daniel has been classed with the prophets. And that tradition has carried into our English Bibles as well. And for most of us, we grew up identifying Daniel as one of the major prophets. So we think about Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel as the 4 major prophets. Well, it might surprise you to learn that in the Hebrew tradition, Daniel is not associated with the prophets. The Jews don't really consider Daniel to be a prophet per se. The reason for this is because in the Hebrew Bible, and the Hebrew tradition, Daniel has always been associated with a different section of the canon called the writings. Now, this is a section of the Bible that is more identified with the Psalms, the wisdom literature, and things of that nature. So the book of Daniel in the Jewish tradition has been much more associated with wisdom, with a particular kind of wisdom, a mantic kind of wisdom. And because it didn't really fit in what the Jews considered to be prophetic literature, it was placed in this 3rd section of their canon called the writings. So there's even been some disagreement as to precisely what the book of Daniel is. Is it a book of prophecy, or is it something else? Well, in Christianity, it has traditionally been associated with prophecy, but in Judaism, it has traditionally been associated with a different kind of literature that doesn't really fit the prophetic mold. So that's another thing that makes the book somewhat difficult to deal with. Then, fourthly, I would say that the book of Daniel remains largely inaccessible to contemporary Christians because it has a decidedly non-Western and really quite confusing approach to time and history. So the book of Daniel introduces us to some historical figures that we don't read about anywhere else. And I mean anywhere else. Not anywhere else in the Bible, not anywhere else in other accounts of the history of the Persian era or the Hellenistic Empire that followed it. So the book of Daniel stands entirely alone in its unique idiosyncratic perspective on the history that transpired in the transition, particularly from the Babylonian to the Persian to the Greek empires. Now, this has led many critical scholars to suggest that for this reason, the book of Daniel is not historical, or at the very least that the book of Daniel has made historical mistakes. I think that it's probably better to think in terms of the book of Daniel as doing something different than what we expect. That it's not that the book of Daniel has made historical errors, so much it is that the book of Daniel isn't really straightforward historiography. It's not meant to be traditional Western history in the way we think. So we have to kind of adjust our expectations of what the book of Daniel is doing. If we do that, then I think that these issues are not quite so problematic. But that's a difficult adjustment for us because as modern Westerns, we have a particular approach to time and history, and the book of Daniel just doesn't jive with that at all. And so it requires us to really adjust our expectations in a big way. That doesn't come easily for us. Finally, the fact that this book exists in multiple editions, I think, also has made it a difficult one for Christians to deal with. Now, what I mean by this is that the book of Daniel, as we have it in our English Bibles, consists of only 12 chapters. But if you were to look at the book of Daniel in the Greek tradition, you would suddenly realize that it has a chapter 13 and a chapter 14 appended to it. These are stories that are included in the Apocrypha, but not in our traditional Protestant canon, nor are they included in the Hebrew canon of the book of Daniel. So these are stories called Bel and the Dragon and Susanna. Then in addition to that, there are some additions within the book of Daniel. So for example, in the middle of chapter 3, there's this extended prayer of Azariah that is included in the Greek version of the book, but that doesn't show up at all in the Hebrew, and therefore not in our English translations. The prayer of Azariah is also something that has traditionally been associated with the Apocrypha. So for these reasons, the book of Daniel has been a little off-putting, I think, to Christians. It's been something that we've been hesitant to get into because it throws us all these curveballs. It presents all these difficulties. But that leads to this. I think why it's valuable to think about the book of Daniel in terms of its relationship to the New Testament is that I think that this potentially may help Christians find a point of access to the book of Daniel. This may give us our entryway into this book. If we start in the New Testament and we think about the way in which the New Testament relies on the book of Daniel, draws from its imagery, uses some of its language and numerology and symbols, that might give us the access that we're looking for to give us a starting point for getting into this book and understanding its importance and its theological message for us. And for that reason, I'm excited to think about how the book of Daniel relates to the New Testament. And what I want to do in this brief introduction is just give you a taste of some things that I'll be unpacking in much greater detail next year at our lectureship. And so I hope that you'll be able to join us at that time so that the things I'm about to share with you briefly, I might be able to explain in greater detail. So let's just get an overview then for a moment about how the book of Daniel has in fact impacted the New Testament and some things that I'll be wanting to discuss in greater detail with you later. Perhaps the most important impact that the book of Daniel has made on the New Testament has been its introduction to us of a figure called the Son of Man. We are introduced to this figure, the Son of Man, in Daniel chapter 7. This is in the midst of one of Daniel's visions. And I want you to listen to the way Daniel describes this. I'm going to begin in verse 9 of Daniel chapter 7, and then you'll be able to see the context in which this Son of Man figure appears in Daniel's dream. Daniel says, "As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking, and as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season at a time. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Now, you probably are familiar with this phrase, Son of Man, from the Gospels, because it is, in fact, Jesus' preferred way of referring to himself in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and occasionally in John, but mostly in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So we may be baffled a bit by this. Why does Jesus refer to himself as the Son of Man? What is he communicating by that? Well, I think what Jesus means to do is to identify himself with this figure that Daniel saw in his dream in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. Now, this was a convenient figure for Jesus to appeal to, because the Jews themselves were not entirely sure what to make of this figure that Daniel references here in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. And since Jesus was very careful about how and when he introduced himself to Israel as their Messiah, this designation had the kind of ambiguity that he needed to avoid being pigeonholed by their incorrect expectations of their Messiah figure, their preconceptions of who the Messiah would be and what he would do. So Jesus uses this designation more often than any other in reference to himself. But it also indicates that Jesus anticipates being given a dominion that will never end. And so Daniel 7 verse 14 ascribes to the Son of Man a kingdom that will last throughout the ages. So this is a perfect platform for Jesus to begin to introduce himself as the eternal king, the successor to David's throne, who will never need to be succeeded. So the Son of Man designation, so prevalent in Jesus' teaching, that his preferred way of referring to himself actually is based on this passage in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. So clearly a very important connection there exists between the book of Daniel and the New Testament. But another connection between Daniel and the New Testament has to do with a portrayal of Jesus that we find early on in Mark's Gospel, a portrayal of Jesus that seems to compare him to Daniel. Look with me, if you will, for just a moment at Mark's account of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. We find this in verses 12 and 13 of Mark chapter 1. Now, Mark's account of Jesus' temptation is by far the briefest. It includes none of the details of the three different temptations. It simply says this: the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days being tempted by Satan. And he was with the wild animals, and angels were ministering to him. So there are two interesting facts that Mark tells us about Jesus' experience in the wilderness that we're not really told by Matthew or Luke. We're told that he was with the wild animals and that angels ministered to him. Now, what's interesting about this is that these two facts happen to line up precisely with Daniel's experience in the lion's den. Because when Daniel was cast into the lion's den, he too was among the wild animals, and he too was ministered to by angels. It was an angel of the Lord that came and protected Daniel from the lions on that occasion. So I suspect that what Mark may be doing here is he may be making an association between Jesus and Daniel in preparation for Jesus' use of the title Son of Man. But then there's also the fact that the book of Daniel introduces us to an event, a dreaded event that it anticipates, that it mentions in Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, that Jesus also mentions, that Jesus indicates is about to occur. In Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, God's people are being prepared for a very tragic event, a traumatic event, that will disrupt their lives for quite a while. It's an event that will actually render the temple unclean and therefore unusable for their worship for an extended period of time. And we're told about this in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 11. I'm going to begin in verse 10. So the angel that is explaining Daniel's vision to him says, "Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. But those who are wise shall understand. And from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate," or as it is said in some translations, the desolating sacrilege, "is set up, there shall be 1290 days." Well, this fascinating and oblique reference to this abomination that makes desolate, or this desolating sacrilege, or the abomination of desolation, as it was traditionally translated in the King James Version, is mentioned again in Jesus' Olivet Discourse that we find in Mark chapter 13, verse 14, and in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, when he's preparing his disciples for the imminent destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in particular. He's indicating that there are certain signs that they can be looking for, certain indicators that this event is on the horizon. And one of the things he tells them to watch for is this desolating sacrilege, this abomination of desolations that was mentioned in Daniel chapter 12. It becomes a signal to his disciples that this is about to happen, and that when they see this, then they will know that the destruction of the temple and the city as a whole is very near, and that if at all possible, they should get away from the city if they happen to be there at that time. So we need to think about what this meant to Daniel in Daniel chapter 12 to understand what Jesus is referring to in his Olivet Discourse. And that's something that I want to talk about in a special session I have next year on this, where we'll unpack the meaning of this event, this symbol, and really try to understand what it meant, what it signified, and what Jesus was referring to as well. Then we have the fact that there are some New Testament characters that we encounter that have their origin in the book of Daniel. So for example, you think about the beast that we encounter in Revelation. In fact, there are 3 beasts, right? There's the sea beast, the land beast, and the dragon. All of them bear some similarities, some resemblances to beasts that we first encounter in the book of Daniel. So it becomes clear that the book of Revelation, that the kinds of visions that John saw on the Isle of Patmos, have some close relationship to Daniel's visions in Daniel chapter 7 through 12. But in particular, the beast, the man of lawlessness, and the Antichrist that we meet in the New Testament all seem to be modeled after characters in the book of Daniel. Now, a lot of these symbols in the book of Daniel are pointing towards a particular Gentile ruler who severely persecuted God's people. This ruler that Daniel was referring to was Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes became a kind of prototype of subsequent Gentile rulers who would similarly severely persecute God's people. And so subsequent Gentile rulers that play a similar role are sometimes identified by the same symbols that Daniel used to identify Antiochus. So those same symbols then can be used of Domitian, for example, in the book of Revelation, or to whoever Paul may be referring to in 2 Thessalonians when he refers to the man of lawlessness. And in the case of the Antichrist, mentioned only in 1 John, it refers to a variety of those who oppose the spread of God's kingdom, whether they be rulers or not. All of these seem to have their roots in characters that we first meet in the book of Daniel. And so to properly understand them, it's important to understand the role that they play in Daniel. Then we have Jesus' teaching on the bodily resurrection. Now, it's hard to imagine a more significant or important part of the Christian faith than that. The hope that we have that we will be raised bodily from our graves in order to enjoy a new creation with our risen Lord. Interestingly, much of Jesus' teaching about the bodily resurrection is drawn from a few details shared in one of Daniel's vision, the one that he has in Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. take a look at it with me, and then I'll show you how similar it is to something that Jesus says about the resurrection in the Gospel of John. But when we go to Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, this is what we read. I'm going to begin in verse 1. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, every one whose name shall be found in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now, what's so fascinating about Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, is that it is probably the most explicit reference in the Old Testament to a general resurrection. Now, what I mean by a general resurrection is that not only the righteous, but the wicked will be raised from the grave as well, in order to face a judgment that will permanently separate them. So that there is a resurrection that Daniel describes as a resurrection to everlasting life, and then another resurrection that he describes as a resurrection to shame and to everlasting contempt. Well, this parallels very closely what Jesus teaches about the resurrection in the Gospel of John chapter 5. And it seems clear that he is elaborating upon this truth that we first saw in the book of Daniel. So in the Gospel of John chapter 5, beginning in verse 25, this is what we read. Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead shall hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment." Jesus here similarly makes reference to a general resurrection. All the dead, the good and the evil, will rise and face judgment and then be permanently separated. So those who have accepted Christ will be risen to a resurrection of life, but those who have not will rise to a resurrection of judgment, just as Daniel indicated in Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Then finally, and we've already alluded to this a little bit, but I want to expand it now. Much of the imagery and numerology that is found in the book of Revelation is borrowed from the book of Daniel. Now, the book of Revelation is also a book that frightens us, that we find difficult. But when we recognize that much of its imagery is drawn from the book of Daniel, it gives us a place to start. If we can come to terms with what these images meant in the book of Daniel, it gives us a significant key to understand how they function also in the book of Revelation. So let me just give you some examples of things that we find in Daniel that John then uses and develops in Revelation. So for example, the concept of a sealed scroll that is then unsealed. John gets that from Daniel. That's a common image in what we call apocalyptic literature. The last half of the book of Daniel is apocalyptic in nature, and John is drawing from that rich stock of imagery himself as he experiences his own visions and conveys them to his beleaguered churches. The description of angels that you find in the book of Daniel informs the way John understands what he is seeing in his visions as he beholds the heavenly realms and as he encounters angels. He even uses some of the same names for them that Daniel uses. So, for example, Michael the archangel is mentioned in the book of Daniel, and then he is also mentioned in the book of Revelation, but seldom mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament except for, of course, the book of Jude. Then we have just the fact that saints and angels are portrayed in both books by means of the stars. So this astral imagery that plays such a significant role in the book of Daniel also plays a significant role in the book of Revelation, and for similar reasons. Because astral imagery was such a part of the broader culture of the world in which these books played a part. Astrology, looking to the stars as portents and signs of things to come, was common among the various people groups to whom God's people bore witness. So it's not surprising that they might draw some of the same images to make points with regard to Yahweh and Yahweh's governance of history as well. So these are some of the ways in which the book of Daniel has significantly shaped the New Testament. And maybe by starting in the New Testament and working our way back to Daniel, this may give us an opening, an access point to a book that is otherwise inaccessible to us. Very mysterious, very difficult. Thank you. I hope you'll join us next year when we'll take a little bit more time to unpack these ideas and thoughts. Look forward to seeing you then.